This is a recent recreation of KV55, a skull that's been found with some bones, along with a cache of mummies in a tomb known as KV55, not far from the tomb of King Tutankamun, only like 2 doors down. In fact, it's believed that the people looting the one next to King Tut, along with a landslide that happened from above it that partially covered it in the first place, and then those people looting it and ditching all their stuff out to the right kind of covered King Tut's and left it alone. It's believed also that this was looted in ancient times, and then after the looting, and it was well known it was looted pretty much, then they were taken, mummies that were taken from the Amarna period were taken into this tomb, kind of like for safekeeping, and then covered back up, just like it had been looted and ruined already, and left in that state, kind of like if anybody was trying to do it, they'd be like, oh, somebody's already been in here and all of that, right? So they've done a few recreations here, and recently, in fact just earlier this year, we got a genetics paper that actually deals with the entire 18th dynasty and their DNA and genetics. We'll get into that in a moment, but it's very possible what we're looking at here is a recreation of Akenaten, the famous king of monotheism and father of King Tut. I know we see a Amarna period drawing and artistic representations, but the reason everybody freaks out on that is because they kind of went weird there on the fact that for nearly 2,000 years they had kept the same symbology. In fact, it gotten to the point, well, it started out, and especially with the scribes and so on, which we might look at here in a minute, where they draw them very realistic, or as realistic as they could kind of at that time. But then quickly they reverted to an ideal that was kind of like ancient Photoshop, and everybody kind of had this same look. And though they may have looked chubby or had an appearance that was a little bit different from what you see, their pharaonic statue was drawn in somebody that was in their godly state, if you will. A lot of people have made comments about this, but you can look at some of these. They have quite a few artistic pieces of them, and by looking at the variations of them, people say, well, if once you look at the variations of them, you can kind of see the person that was there. And it's really not held within the natural statue, but you might see it in the Ba and Ka statues and some of the other regular statues and get more of an idea of what they look like. But that's an imagination, and it takes a lot of imagination to do this type of work where they recreate things. But then once you see this, it kind of takes a lot of the imagination out of it. I think he made a few mistakes, but we're going to talk about those in a moment too. And this just came out in March of 2021, revealing the face and identity of the controversial mummy KV55. Ever since the mummy KV55 was discovered in 1907, it has generated deep interest, debate, and controversy. The big issues have been identifying the KV55 mummy in ancient Egyptian history and combining its most probable identities with that person's proposed age of death. Could mummy KV55 really be the heretic pharaoh Akenaten, as many scholars believe? If so, a team of scientists at the Forensic Anthropology, Paleopathology, and Bioarchaeology, or FABAB, Research Center in Sicily, Italy, have finally revealed this image of famous pharaoh. And it's nothing like how he was portrayed in the ancient artworks. Yeah, again, the Amarna artworks are drawn somewhat weird and artistic. Doesn't really show it almost from this angle, but this looks different than the other depictions here. But it does have that one effect where if you looked at it head on, he has a kind of stretched out, a little bit of a horse face, but nowhere near as bad as some of the other depictions, a couple of which we'll see here in a second. But the other idea is they draw him somewhat hermaphroditic a little bit here, because lo and behold, he's got man boobs, if not boo boobs. He's got a little pooch on his belly too, and especially whenever they show him sitting down, just like most people, if you have any fat on you at all, whenever you sit down, it'll cause a little roll to happen there. But people have made a lot of comments about it. And of course, the idea of their inbreeding and so on like that, that maybe that left him stricken with something. And of course, King Tut stricken with like a clubfoot idea. And so they decided to look at their genetics in a deeper way here in 2010. And everybody said they were going to come out with the genetics and the things and the, understanding of it. And of course, all he was with it, and all he did was come out and say that, yeah, they're all related, but he didn't give the genetic information. And that, of course, got real suspicious, and a lot of things that he does added up to the point that eventually things happened and he got kicked out of that idea. Well, those people that were with that genetic test were able to get another test set done on the same mummies and all the things. They're back to it again with the new director was there to finish up their work that they were doing in the first place to finalize the genetics. And we'll get into that here in just a second, but there are facts and controversies surrounding this KV55 mummy, because when they found this stash of mummies, a few of them were in the wrong coffins, and one was out of the coffin. One had been totally looted to the point that its body was broken up in pieces and his head was loose. And that's the one we're talking about here. So it seemed like they had all been mixed up somehow and whatever. And this just reminds me of an ancient book that I got to find again. I've made references to it, but about these people back in the 1800s or whatever that were all importing in mummies, and they were coming in. People were paying real cheap money for them, and they were showing up. And all these records and what people said, it may be a letter to somebody else, but it refers to it and stuff and makes comments of it. And this one where a guy kind of was ticked off a little bit, and it's very British in the way he said it, but he was rather agitated that he had supposedly gotten a male pharaoh mummy, and he had held onto the thing almost a year, and then during a party they opened it up, and it was almost a joke because it was a red-headed lady. And it was supposed to have been a pharaoh or whatever, and this box, and they talked about all the writings on it and everything, this is supposed to have been a male that was in there. And in the book it talks about how a lot of times they would take a mummy that was really not a royalty or anything like that and put it in a box that was left over for a royal that was taken already and ransacked, so there was at least a good box that was left. In fact, you could get money for a box. You get money for a mummy, but if you had a mummy in a box and that looked pretty cool, you get some decent amount from it. Something online of $15, but back in that day you could buy a horse and a saddle for 20, so it really, even in the modern day, just seems like it's cheaped out. So this mummy was found with grave goods attributed to different people and a desecrated coffin in the undecorated tomb of KV55 in the Valley of the Kings in 1907 by Egyptologist named Edward R. Ayrton. In fact, I believed at the first part of it, they said that there was also some extra embalming materials and stuff that people would have used for other stuff, and it wasn't set up. It wasn't set up even like King Tut's tomb, which even seems like a rush if you've ever gotten into it. This tomb is just a few meters away from King Tutankamun's tomb. Tried to say that forwards and backwards at the same time. Upon excavation, mummy KV55 disintegrated into dust and bones, and so today is only a skeleton, but there's a skull left. We'll take a look at that depiction in a minute. It was first suggested to be Queen Ti, due to a broad pelvis that it had, so it might be a woman. But Australian scientist Grafton E. Smith later declared the remains were a male. Mummy KV55's genetic results show that this is the genetic father of Tutankamun. However, paleomolecular experts criticized some of the results back in 2010. Again, this is why they did it again, and they did it again when it first came out. They didn't come out with the haplogroups and so on, so it worked out. And people got a view of this, and so getting a view off a screen of it, people that worked with the same software and equipment were able to tell you by at a glance, because they do it all day long, that's R1b. Well, when the new paper just came out earlier this year, they wanted to criticize those people a little bit, but tell them kind of they were true. It is R1b, but it's actually R1b1a, and it's R1b1a, which is a subclad now known as RM269. But it's R1b, and they were right about that. In fact, that's the connection that they've made. And so through the autosomal DNA, like you would do on Maury Povich or one of those shows, they were able to show that there's this direct connection going down to it. There's also a question if the connection is actually someone who is a brother rather than Akenaten himself, and we still haven't found it and everything. There's still a question. I think there will always be a question. But then again, whenever you find everybody all together, if it did work out that way, he'd kind of be the only one missing. On the flip side of that card, you could say, due to what happened and everything that came and expelled after that, it's possible that he could have gone missing. But if his mummy had already been desecrated shortly after his even interment in the first place, and the priest had all found that and realized, hey, everybody's going after this shit right off the bat because they have no respect for him anymore, we're going back to the old ways and all that, people that at least had enough respect for everything that went on took and hid these off in a place that really no one had any idea would really be connected with a pharaoh. And it really is kind of like the old broom closet. So, historical and archaeological research, including some artifacts in the tomb, suggests that the mummy KV55 is Akenaten. Akenaten from 1353 or 36 to 35 BC is known as the heretic pharaoh because he developed monotheism, changing everything and worshiping the one true god of Aten, which was a sun disk, but it's kind of like monotheism as like in the Bible. He was the son of Amenhotep III and the father of Tutankamun. In fact, in that genetic paper that I've got a video about, in fact I've got two of them, and Egyptologist 7, if you look up her channel, also has two videos on it also. One's right whenever the first thing came out, and then second whenever she was able to go through the paper, and they talk about a direct lineage, and it goes back farther than this, for it goes back to Amenhotep I and through the lineages, just like it would from father to son in the way genetics follows. And so if they find that it had the same genetics falling in that line, that's a key point right there. I'm sure if checking it to haplogroups and things, they did do the Maury type thing, because this is one of the things they did it for in the first place, is to check out who, what, and how does this guy fit into the scheme of things. But also, if they could look deeper and see, because of suspected inbreeding, if that was a cause and if there was any problems. If this widening of the hips was something like Marfan syndrome that you've heard talked about maybe whenever they talk about the possibilities of what these weird statues would mean. But then just like that first statue that I showed you there, that guy doesn't show that effect really, but it does show a little poochy belly and kind of man boobs, if not real boobs. So kind of odd there, right? So historical evidence, though, which is fragmented and conflicting, suggests that Akenaten died when he was about 40 years old, However, mummy KV55 belongs to a man who is believed to have died in his early 20s. Some scholars argue that mummy KV55's age of death demonstrate that this is actually an enigmatic late Amarna period person named Spinkare. You may have heard that name before, but there's also a good question, even now, that might have actually been Akenaten's widow changing her name to a pharaonic name as she held on to it until Tut became old enough to take the crown. And what was it, 11 years? That's kind of the date they do it. It's kind of teening, and it looked like that's what may have happened to he himself. So there's a reigning period of that. We'll get into that here a little bit more. An exclusive interview with Dr. Michael E. Habich, this person here had, FAPAB director of Francesco Galassi, a physician and paleopathologist, and Egyptological studies coordinator Michael E. Habich oversaw the creation of the new facial reconstruction of the KV55 mummy, which is completed by the well-known Brazilian expert Cicero Moraes. He has been recognized for his skilled facial reconstructions, so they asked him to do it. It wasn't necessarily the same person that they did to use for King Tut, but I think just looking at this you can kind of see a resemblance, but he wasn't told who this was. He was told it was an Egyptian man. Yeah, that's basically it, the young Egyptian man, and he pulled this out of just the skeletal features. They also talk about the skin tone here in a minute. We'll get into that. Dr. Michael E. Habich, who is also an archaeologist, Egyptologist, and senior research fellow at Flinders University, Australia, told us about the new facial reconstruction and the research team's perspectives on the mysteries surrounding the mummy KV55. There's a little better picture of it here. Let me let that go away. And Kelly's looking at a distance. To me, he has a little bit squinty eyes. It seems like a lot of people, when they do an Egyptian, they will because of the makeup that all goes around their eyes and something. Of course, you might think of bright light being around Egypt, but inside of a building and so on. To me, an expression like this almost looks like he's looking almost 80, 100 yards away at two people and trying to figure out what they're saying or who's who, in a way. I don't know. There's a little bit of that concerned look, but you could also see in a moment that he would sag his cheeks just a little bit, and if you were to come up to him and be talking, you could see that sag cheek effect, and then to the smile that he has. Another effect where I'd say he really looks a lot like King Tut is in his overbite that he has, that his skull showed along with this. It's kind of a little family trait they had going on all the way from Tutmosis going through. They all seem to have this overbite that carried father to son, father to son. I can feel the same way. My father had a slight one. My brother had one, had to get braces. I've got one myself. It's just where your front teeth overreach your bottom, but I don't look like this. It's not necessarily buck-toothed or anything, but it's a little bit that way, isn't it? One discerning point about this that I disagree with is their eye color and uses of such. They just went ahead and gave him dark brown eyes. They also left out any possibility for hair color, but we know that his at least grandparents of him were Thuya and Yuya, and they're both blondes. Perhaps I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And we'll also look at a picture of King Tut's recreation. Wish I could just put it right beside this, because looking at that you could probably see somewhat of a resemblance. Alicia McDermott, please describe the process used to create this facial reconstruction. Well, Dr. Habich said, based on published data and images from various studies, a three-dimensional skull model of KV55 was created. This was then checked again against the images. And so you can look here, and why it looks like maybe it's kind of made out of fiberglass webbing somewhat, or something like that. What this actually is are a little bitty point to point to point to point to point to point to point in a computer matching up to an exact skull. And so you can see it here matching up to all these points. And again, note that prominent jaw. That's one thing I didn't really describe there. Pardon me, finger of God reaching in here, but you can see that overbite that's there. Well, that's going to mess it up. You can see the overbite that's there, but also in the thick and prominent jaw. That's something that King Tut doesn't have so much. This extra jaw where it comes down like this, that you can see, and therefore the jaw has a real thickness to it. King Tut seems to be just, oh, not that much, but discernibly less. We're going to go back up to that other picture now, and I want you to look at his jaw. And from his bottom teeth or bottom lip to the bottom of his jaw is a much farther point than there would be on King Tut's recreation. That's one thing that I did notice, but other than that, could you say he was his kid? Sure, yeah. Looking at both of them, I seem to think so. It's neat how they do this forensic work. They can do it to somebody who died just a few years ago, or they can do it to somebody from thousands of years ago. It still works out the same. Facial muscles, eyes, fat pads, and skin are now modeled on the digital skull model using the so-called Manchester method. The tissue thickness is determined for numerous anatomical points based on forensic mean values, well-known mean values. The skin, eyes, and shape of the ears are approximation based on the fact he says that it's an Egyptian, which accounts for brown eyes and skin complexion that is still common in Egypt today. This is where I have a description, because the genetic paper that came out, not about King Tut and this thing I was talking about before, but last year before that, was a whole set of over 100, I believe it was 113 different mummies they got the genetics out of, and 93 of them they said were totally clean and viable. 3 of them they got the entire genome out of, but they were able to discern all the genetics out of that. Whenever they did, they said, what they were expecting to find is some type of mixed baby perhaps, or who knows what, but they were really wanting to see, whenever the Persians invaded and the Greeks invaded and then the Romans, how it changed through time. The remarkable thing was that really wasn't a mixed people. They seem to have been kind of the same. Well, the closest relatives are basal Eurasians and European people today and early ancient Anatolians, and they make that discrepancy because this is the people they find the genetics of in this area in ancient Anatolia that are now more a European, if you will. And that the admix that is in the current population shows up at the very end of everything, at the end of the Roman period, whenever slavery started and all of those type things come in with Islam, and with that brought a new genetics into all of Egypt. In fact, the current Egyptians only have about a 1% match with all of the ones that they went through at Abu Sir el-Melek, yet the ones that do look like they're like it must be related to the Coptics that are still there somewhat. So there's still a remnant left. But why would they have more brown skin? Why would they have our admix looking skin, which he used that for his recreation, where they're more olive skin? That's what we're talking about. When they say ancient Mediterraneans used to have darker skin, it's not some cheddar man type of thing, people. It's just something a little bit darker like this. But we'll never know exactly what that shade is. And if they still tanned over and above that, you could get quite dark. But he accounts for brown eyes and brown skin, and that complexion is still common in Egypt today, but it wasn't the way that it was before. That's the reason I have a lot of problem with people trying to make the connections like that. Because whenever they do, they leave out the fact that people have migrated and things have changed over time, and it's well known. Therefore, if you try to say, well, what's there now was what there then, you may not quite get an accurate representation of that. So how does this facial reconstruction balance forensic art with the anatomical and anthropological information? Well, the man that tells you the facial reconstruction was blindfolded. Sister Morales, our expert for face reconstruction, only received the skull data and the information that it was a man from Egypt and not older than 25 years or so. Therefore, this reconstruction has no Egyptian crowns or royal jewelry to distort the impression. Therefore, we think that our reconstruction is as objective as possible and follows purely scientific methods. Here we see that reconstruction where they get the skull and all the types, and they plot upon that what would have been the basic depth of skin in certain parts. I think it's kind of weird. It's almost like gross if you think about it too. If they were to really skin somebody, basically, if you could just take somebody and skin them, these are all the muscles that make below. And instead of just trying to wing it, they're actually trying to put all the muscles about the size they should be and everything in all the places they should be, showing from the points of pull that are on the skull. And then they come over that with another layer that's just like the skin to a depth that you can see gradiated from right here. And that little band, it's the same as over here, right? And in doing so, bam, that should recreate the face. Certain things are dictated by the size of the teeth, the mouth, the way that the pinch comes in from the sides, the nose and its aperture and so on like that, the way the bridge comes out, leaving the way that the nose is going to come out at a certain aquiline type angle and so on like goes on there. But in this picture, it seems like he has almost gray eyes. In a minute, we're going to take a look at the earliest of Egyptian statues and see that they may not had brown eyes and things like you'd think of that are there today. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the skin color of ancient Egyptians. Could you please tell us how you made the choice of skin color for this reconstruction? Well, he says it's indeed a highly debated topic, but it should be assessed with an open mind, pushing away the racist connotations that have characterized this debate in the past. We decided to use the skin tone 4 in the Fitzpatrick scale of 1 through 6, which is typically encountered in Egypt and in the Mediterranean, an olive complexion. Based on the available evidence, it would be unrealistic to opt for a much lighter or a much darker skin tone. Eventually, new genetic analysis of KV55's remains would add more evidence. Well, lo and behold, there was more evidence. They got his haplogroup out of that, and his haplogroup shows R1b. Yeah, and so does King Tut and their granddad. Thuya and Yuyu, which are grandparents, are one half of what makes up his grandparents' lineage down to him, are actually G2 for the male and mtDNA-K. From there down, all the females are mtDNA-K. So there's a constant that you see here in things, but they say eventually new analysis. Well, this analysis was done. Whenever you get somebody with R1b, you get a skin tone that's about like this. Thing is, that's actually a hair darker than we were looking at a minute ago, and I'm Irish. But if I lived in Egypt and got out, well, I don't know if I was a king if I would, but if I got out regularly and everything, like when I used to play golf and so on, I get quite a bit darker than I am now. Definitely darker than cardboard. So there would be that. But then there's also the concept of what goes along with R1b. There's a few things that are very catchy. Cool airplane. That go with R1b. So now we look at him and you can tell that he almost looks like that Legolas dude somewhat. He also reminds me of a few different people, or a twist of a few different people, some of which I knew. Some people maybe I saw in movies, but the hair's missing in here. Tell me who you think this looks like. But the common eye color with R1b is, well, it's always light eye color usually, you know? And the common eye color that goes with it is blue. Now let's look at something real quick here if we can, and then come back. if we were to take a look at, wow, is it going to lock up on me? I shouldn't have hit the button before I even went. Here, let's see if I can get that back. Now let's do this. There we go. Yeah, it's going to lock up because I did that a minute ago, guys. Well, here's that DNA genetics reveals a history of ancient Egyptians. And this was the one that showed from the Middle Kingdom all the way through till the end, and how they thought it would change, but it never really did. Let's see if I can make this stop. I really hate trying to edit these things because the editor is not very precise and it cuts things out. It's terrible. Come on. For a while, you've probably seen this in a bunch of other videos, but these are, if you simply type in at DuckDuckGo, which is very similar to any other ones, that under images, and you choose blue-eyed Egyptians. What we're looking at is some of the scribes and pharaohs of the earliest dynasties, all the way to the 12th dynasties, with the latest one that's associated with this. But there are people that say that that's actually from the second dynasty Ka statue, and it was saved also. Also here at the very edge is Nefertiti. And just in the edge of the shot, you can see that that's one blue eye that she still has left, that are like these rest of them, which are crystal blue eyes. Let me zoom in and give you an idea of this. And they put this dot behind the eye and everything, and it kind of follows you around the room. So one could bet the way that this works is that they're father and son, and while the oldest son gets taken to be the next pharaoh, what happens to all the other princes? Well, they turn into scribes and other types of nobility, and as it grows and grows, there get to be more and more of these jobs. But of course, over time, they have kids and so on. The way this actually works, breaking down, is that that's whenever they tried to discern the different dynasties, and the way that they work is that it's father and son, and it works all the way through, and then whenever that gets clipped, some of it's still related to those people, maybe uncles and cousins, but it's the people that have the best lineage from straight up. That's what they always work off of. And that ends up being the next dynasty. That's how Manetho came up with the idea of breaking into dynasties and so on too. There's been a few times though that they're already figured out in this that whenever they say that, well, here's where the dynasty changes at this pharaoh, they've now looked all into it, and no, that was related to this guy back here. That's a continuation. Irregardless, this is the very first dynasties, and there's a lot of these blue-eyed statues, and you can see them in Egypt as well as the earliest of Sumerians and so on, and their ruling class. But over here at the left, these are two statues that were found in the early Nakata II period. This is pre-dynastic, before the pharaohs and so on, and it goes through like that. So whenever I say I question it, because they're not showing this one fact that's well known. In fact, it's in this museum that they see right there. There's really probably not a question whenever you look at this girl on the left as opposed to the one that's in the center here, on whether or not the one on the left was mixed in some way, and the one on the right's got some mix of some people like the ones on the left, well, a whole lot of some other stuff in there. Something that you would probably find in Egypt today that you definitely would not have found in the earliest of dynasties. This is Nofret. Her husband Rahotep kind of looks like another one bites the dust. We also have the ideal here of Thuya and Yuya, and they're both blonde-haired mummies. I know people see dark-skinned mummies, and they question that. But when you take somebody like this, and they die and they turn into a mummy, they're going to look like beef jerky. But then over and above that, they shellac them with a bitumen mixed with a bunch of herbs and drugs and stuff. Also, it has mixed into it conifer tar. It's a pine tree type sap, much like pine tar resin on the end of a bat, baseball bat, that dark shit that they put on there to make it tacky. Yeah, so they're basically black lacquered like that. But you can see her blonde hair, curly as can be. In fact, Ginger is the pre-dynastic blonde-haired Ghibelline mummy that comes from the time before Egypt had even formed. Now let's look at King Tut's recreation. I'll just say it just like that. Well, I doubled on the O. But now whenever they show him, and you thought about what we were looking at before, I think you can kind of see a connection somewhat to him in his nose, in the shape of his mouth and his lips and his slightly bucked teeth too. But you do kind of notice it, especially because I said so. He doesn't have as prominent of a chin. That doesn't mean anything. Could have got that from his mom. Hell, the golden statue on the left doesn't have as big a chin either, does it? Still got that beard thing hanging off of it. Again, King Tut's DNA is R1b, 1a, and so why did they give him the dark greenish brown eyes in this photo? Well, they're trying to be somewhat ambiguous. I think by looking at these pictures, you can realize what was going on and that there's no ambiguity to the way that they looked. And all these blue-eyed connections to it might indicate that a lot of those pharaohs had that same indication going with them, for it's prized right off the beginning in the earliest of dynasties that it goes. Now let's go back to this other paper here. If it'll flip, there we go. And so we've just looked at King Tut. And so when we look at this, I think we see somewhat of a connection. Now, King Tut was still young too, wasn't he? But this guy looks a little more mature, but he's still got a little bit of a young look to him. I think that's because they told him the guy was 25. Off the test that they say, this guy, he could be 25, he could be 27, 28. He could be 38 too. There's no way to take DNA and off DNA tell the date of somebody. It works in different ways than that. You can't just do it off of like, oh, well, did they have wisdom teeth and so on. So you see this other picture here, and again, it's man boobs. Oh, I was going to show you somebody or a couple of pictures that did have man boobs back in the day. In fact, one famous one is Hemwinu. You spell it Hemwinu. He is the architect of the Great Pyramid, and they show him as being kind of chunky. Got a little belly, got a little man boobs on him, got a little double chin. It's one of the only fat Egyptians you'll ever see, although they've already found some mummies. They realized due to the stretched skin compared to all the other ones are, this person was pretty fat. Well, here's her statue and here's the picture on the wall. Yeah, that's Photoshop. What? Yeah, she was a heavy lady. But in this picture, it's showing her as somewhat nominal. So here's that webbing, quite a few thousands of points that are connected to this skull. The skull recreation and the way that it works. Keep showing that jet airplane. So can you see this kind of looks like King Tut there, but then again this guy's got a little more prominent of a chin. It may be only about a quarter of an inch, but I see a bit of a difference. In fact, this guy has an elongated face, kind of like his Amarna portraits are, as compared to the other ones that we looked at are a little more oval. I'm not saying it's a play on words that they end up making him horse-faced in any way. That was something that he chose himself. But the chances of him having blue eyes are greater than the chance of him having brown. You wouldn't take what goes on there now and then say, well, that's predominant there now, although you can still find blue eyes. So it'd probably be brown. That doesn't work. So why is it so difficult to pinpoint an age of the death of this mummy? Oh my God, it's fixing to go into part 2. Well, it wasn't particularly difficult, to be honest, as the comprehensive study by the late anthropologist Eugene Stowhall demonstrated. It required an objective evaluation using all available skeletal districts and a consultation of the recent anthropological literature. We'll go to the next part up in your top left-hand corner. It'll only be a small part to do the finish on this. We'll see you there.